Professor Marjorie Woods as our Gombrich Lecturer. Before saying more about Professor Woods, I should say a little about the lecture series itself. The E.H. Gombrich Lectures on the Classical Tradition and accompanying book series are sponsored jointly by the Warwick Institute and Princeton University Press. The Gombrich Lecture is chosen by a distinguished panel of experts and is expected to give a series of 3 lectures which will subsequently be published by Princeton University Press. We are very grateful to the press for their generous support of these lectures and for the contribution to scholarship that they entail. The first series of lectures was given last year by Jonathan Bate, Provost for Worcester College, Oxford, entitled Ancient Strength, and focusing on Shakespeare and the classical tradition. This year's series is called Weeping for Dido, the classics in the medieval classroom, and has a rather different focus. Marjorie Woods, whom we know as Jory, has made her reputation for the meticulous work she has done in recreating what was going on in the medieval classroom. By analysing the glosses and commentaries in the margins of innumerable manuscripts of the classics and of the medieval manuals on how to write Latin prose and poetry, she has managed to bring to life not only the academic discussions of the students and masters, but also the emotions, the feelings of the students as they read these texts. She owes her formation in medieval studies, paleography, and the editing of Latin texts to the alma mater of such studies in America, the Medieval Institute of the University of Toronto. Having taught in Oberlin College, the University of Rochester, and as a visiting professor at the Université Paul Valéry in Montpellier, she rose through the ranks of the English department of the University of Texas in Austin, until she acquired a plethora of titles. I won't read them all out, but it includes Professor of Comparative Literature, English and Comparative Literature, the Jane and Roland Blumberg Centennial Professor of English, and University Distinguished Teaching Professor. So, a wonderful series of titles there. She's visiting us from the American Academy in Berlin, and she will be a visiting fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, in the spring. No study of medieval and Renaissance English literature, which is the department she's in, is complete without a knowledge of the Latin learning lying behind this literature, either as models for the texts or as the formation for the writers of the texts. And it is to this essential Latin background that Jory had devoted her scholarship. The fruit of this is the book, Classroom Commentaries Teaching the Poetria Nova Across Medieval and Renaissance Europe, which was published in 2010, and a large number of articles on how students were taught to write, how they were taught to read, the classroom as a courtroom, teaching adults, women readers, and above all, the emotions in the classrooms in which the students were mainly or entirely young boys. It is to this last subject, which is Jory's present obsession, may I say, that the series of lectures that we are about to hear will be devoted. And without further ado, I hand the talking over to her.
Thank you for that captivating introduction. And I want to express my gratitude to the Warburg Institute and to Princeton University Press for bringing me here and for sponsoring these lectures and just creating such a wonderful environment and a sense of community here too. Can you hear me, or do we need to do it? It's all right? Okay. I was coughing a little bit earlier, so if it starts to get difficult and you can't hear me, just raise your hand and then we'll fiddle around with the things up here. I was set the task of memorizing the wanderings of Aeneas, whoever he was, and of grieving over the death of Dido, since she killed herself for love. I wept for Dido, slain as she sought by the sword an end to her woe. St. Augustine. These lectures will explore a consistent pedagogical thread of the Middle Ages in the Latin West. That is, how schoolboys learned the classics, by a method that stressed emotional engagement, often with female figures from those texts. The lectures therefore contribute to one of the goals of the Warburg Institute, the study of the classical tradition as the theme which unifies the history of Western civilization. While I specialize in medieval manuscripts of classical texts from the 13th to the 15th centuries, I will be looking at material of earlier and later periods as well, and so consider the Middle Ages not only a prominent participant in the development and transmission of the classical tradition, but a period crucial to our understanding those coming before and after. We will be looking at an educational project seemingly modest in goal, yet of astounding breadth and chronological persistence. The enduring impact of emotional texts learned in childhood, as part of a long pedagogical tradition of acquiring cultural literacy and amassing capital in a learned academic language, Latin. This tradition is often called grammatical, but I prefer to call it textual and literary, since it was in the lower schools that the classical texts were read, except for the periods of so-called humanism, that is, when adult males take up textual analysis among themselves, rather than leaving it to the boys. Each of these lectures begins with a boy. Today, the historical Augustine, who weeps for the suicide of a fictional queen. Wednesday, that's right, I'm checking myself because we're skipping a day. There's not one tomorrow. Wednesday, the mythical Achilles, who hides out as a girl to avoid the Trojan War. And finally, Thursday, an anonymous boy singer who performs a woman's lament for her dead lover so powerfully that the listener becomes overwhelmed and distraught. The nexus of interests around which these lectures revolve include 1. Classical texts taught in medieval schools, 2. The powerful effect of emotions on the memory of these texts, and 3. The emotional identification or empathy boys felt when they studied and performed such works, particularly texts where they voiced women's strong emotions. I approached this project in 2 ways, both historically, using my own background in reading manuscripts to search glosses in school copies of the Aeneid and other texts for late medieval and early Renaissance reflections of these concerns, and transhistorically, drawing on modern studies of memory and emotion to understand the longue durée of the tradition of empathy across boundaries of gender, among other kinds of boundaries, in the classroom. The title of the project as a whole, Weeping for Dido, comes from the quotation from St. Augustine's Confessions that I read at the beginning. Augustine's stunningly dismissive reaction to Virgil's hero Aeneas in the passage, Nescio quid Aeneas, whoever he was, in F.J. Sheed's inspired phrasing, is in stark contrast to Augustine's obsessive identification with Dido and her emotional pain. The other quotation about Dido and schoolboys that most captures for me the essence of the project, its seeming alterity and counterintuitiveness, is much more recent, from 1968. After watching a modern production of Christopher Marlowe's drama, Dido, Queen of Carthage, performed by schoolboys as Marlowe had originally written it, the editor of the text, H.J. Oliver, remarked, "When a drama such as Dido is acted by boys, it is the parts of the women that come over realistically. A schoolboy has no difficulty in conveying the distress of Dido, but a schoolboy Aeneas cannot be much more than a puppet-like figure, no matter how good an actor he may be, and is bound to seem artificial and even stiff in comparison." This description of the Renaissance of Dido for boys who were not able to relate to adult male Aeneas bears an uncanny resemblance to the first part of Augustine's description of his reaction. Of course, finding traces of emotional responses to classical texts in medieval manuscripts is not easy. But we are fortunate in the studies of a rich trove of medieval manuscript markings that help us locate and analyze such responses in certain manuscripts from the 10th to the 12th centuries. Jan Zokowski and others have examined a special kind of musical notation called neumes that mark specific parts of emotional speeches, often by women. I've been studying later manuscripts and have found that teachers in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries used still other methods, but with special attention to speeches containing emotion, often by women. And of course, aspects of this tradition carry far beyond that time, as Lynn Enterline's recent study has shown. I look at very small pieces of evidence, individual comments, notes, and highlighting written in the margins and between the lines of school manuscripts. And through these small pieces of evidence, capture a record of teachers and students engaged emotionally with classical literary texts. Medieval teaching was relentlessly practical. What had worked earlier continued to be utilized, so pagan Latin texts remained the basis of childhood learning by boys until very, very late in the tradition. Although the story of the classical tradition in the Middle Ages is usually approached from the point of view of adult readers and scholars, it was experienced most often by boys. Their knowledge of classical texts was filtered through the emotions of literary characters, often female characters. While women were overwhelmingly absent from this schoolboy world, except insofar as they inhabited texts, there they often dominated both classroom experience and schoolboys' later memories of the texts. Apparently, teachers consciously chose and taught works with strong emotions because such texts help students memorize and perform them in the classroom. And female characters in classical texts tend to have especially strong emotions. Medieval memory training, as Mary Crothers and others have outlined it for us, supports an important conclusion of modern memory research, quote, that inducing emotional arousal is one way of creating stronger memory, unquote. Indeed, researchers have concluded, quote, the fundamental function of high levels of emotion is to empower the memory system, unquote. Narrative that's emotionally arousing is more memorable, and even word lists are more easily memorized if they have an emotional component. The Aeneid and Dido within it were vehicles of creating textual memory, both word for word, long-lasting memorization of the text itself, but also knowledge of the language in which it was written. Excuse me, I was coughing earlier, so I want to prevent this. In his moving biography of the Bishop of Hippo, who lived from 354 to 430 Common Era, Serge Lancel says that the young Augustine, as a, quote, 12-year-old, loved Latin literature passionately, especially Virgil, the Virgil of the Aeneid, which he knew by heart, unquote. Lancel reminds us that this schoolboy, later saint and father of the church, was raised on pagan literature, and that before his conversion, he was an extremely successful teacher of Latin rhetoric. The famous description of his childhood and education in the Confessions is full of memorable details like hating Greek and stealing pears, but it also describes the beginning of his lifelong obsession with Virgil, itself the subject of more than one monograph. Peter Brown describes Augustine's education as surprisingly meager. He would have read far fewer classical authors than a modern schoolboy. Virgil, Cicero, Sallust, and Terence were the only authors studied in detail. It was excessively literary. Actually, he says exclusively. I just changed that by mistake. Unquote. Yet the depth of this knowledge was profound and based on a complete internalizing of these texts. Brown continues, quote, this education imposed a crushing load on the memory. A friend of Augustine's knew all Virgil and much of Cicero by heart. Actually, that friend could recite Virgil frontwards and backwards. He was a freak. Yet while Augustine calls his memorizing of Aeneas's wanderings a forced process, he remembers Dido effortlessly and associates that memory with strong emotions, particularly remembering her death. Here again, in a slightly longer version, is Augustine's description of responding to her when a boy. He says, I was set the task of memorizing the wanderings of Aeneas, whoever he was, and of grieving for the death of Dido, who killed herself for love. I wept for Dido, slain as she sought by the sword an end to her woe. And if I were kept from reading, I wept at not reading those tales that caused me such grief. Unquote. Augustine's rhetorically powerful repetition of words associated with weeping and death fixes his own emotional reaction in our minds as Dido became fixed in his. Augustine continues, nothing could be more pitiful than a pitiable creature who does not see to pity himself and weeps for the death that Dido suffered through love of Aeneas, and not for the death he suffers himself through not loving you, O God. Unquote. This emphasis on pity and the pitiable Augustine's Latin here is suffused with cognates of miserere, was a consistent aspect of classroom experience. And Augustine tells us that he craved this experience, weeping when kept from the very text that made him weep. Who is the figure Augustine remembers so vividly? Dido enters the Aeneid in Book 1 when the Trojans, who have escaped shipwreck and Juno's anger, which itself was the subject of a school exercise of Augustine's that I'll talk about later in the week, arrive on the shores of Africa, Dido's shore. She's regal, gracious, and welcoming, the perfect ruler and queen, exchanging speeches with the spokesman of those who have survived and arrived at her court. Suddenly she sees Aeneas, who appears before her looking like a god, thanks to help from his mother Venus. Her discourse reflects the beginning of her transformation from majestic queen to supplicant lover. Thus, an important gloss in several late medieval manuscripts calls the beginning of her first speech to him a captatio benevolentiae. That is, here Dido is attempting to gain Aeneas's goodwill, although technically he is the supplicant. Dido is clearly attracted to Aeneas. Venus uses her other son to make Dido fall obsessively in love with him, at a feast where Aeneas recalls for Dido the story of the downfall and burning of Troy and the loss of his wife and the subsequent wanderings of the Trojans. Dido's response, her love, and final suicide all unfold in Book 4, where she and Aeneas become lovers in a cave during a savage storm arranged by Juno and Venus. Dido considers this union a marriage. As she and Aeneas consort together publicly afterwards, the queen increasingly abandons her responsibility as a ruler, and she stops building and she stops creating laws, both of which were completely anathema to the Romans. She loses her reputation as rumor of fama runs through the city and incites the enmity of neighboring rulers, envious, who would like to be in Aeneas's place. After Aeneas receives a blunt reminder from the gods that he needs to continue on his mission to found another Troy in Italy, and Dido realizes that she cannot persuade him to stay, she becomes increasingly frantic and distraught in a sequence of powerful speeches through which she finally comes to tragic terms with his departure. As Aeneas is sailing away, Dido constructs a pyre topped with their bedclothes and the possessions he's left behind. She tells her sister Anna, who's fostered the romance, that the conflagration will enable Dido to, as we might say, move on from the relationship. Instead, she climbs on top of the pyre and kills herself with Aeneas' sword. The manuscript illumination reproduced on the poster for these talks depicts an especially dramatic version of this final scene. In the top half, Dido is throwing herself backwards off the parapet of a castle. Her braids, it's a German manuscript, and crown are already falling into the pyre behind her, and she's also stabbing herself with a sword at the same time. In the bottom half, Aeneas is sailing away. An art historian colleague of mine refers to this picture as Cirque du Soleil Dido. The illustration is very small on the poster, but it comes from the famous manuscript of the Carmina Burana, just after a series of laments based on Dido and the Trojan War, some of which I'll be discussing in later lectures. This manuscript, CLM 4660, in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, is completely digitized online, so you can see it in more detail. This illustration takes up the full page on folio 77 verso. The attraction of such a dramatic and doomed figure is not hard to understand, and in fact, it continues today. When I offered a course for English honors students on women in love, Sappho, Dido, and Eloise, a third of the class said that they had signed up for it because of having translated Dido's speeches in high school Latin classes. While Augustine was probably around 12 years old when he was studying the Aeneid, medieval students for whom Latin was a more difficult language were at least this old, or more probably a little older when they encountered it. Although as an adult, Augustine was guilt-ridden for having felt Dido's emotions more powerfully than his own, such immersion and luxuriating in the pain of literary characters did allow boys to experience varieties of emotion not encouraged or even tolerated outside the classroom, and created a memory that could last a lifetime. The allure of stories full of pathos, fantasy, danger, and death may be one of the most important aspects of the longevity and success of this aspect of the classical tradition. This attraction is illustrated by the other parts of the Aeneid that Augustine liked the most when he was in school, These were, quote, the wooden horse with its armed men, and Troy on fire, and the ghost of Creusa, unquote, Aeneas' Trojan wife who was killed in the fall of Troy. Soldiers hiding in the Trojan horse and the burning of Troy are closer to what we would think of as typical schoolboy interests. But the last scene that Augustine mentions is another extremely pathetic one involving a woman. At the end of Book 2, during the escape from Troy, Aeneas' wife Creusa was inadvertently left behind. When Aeneas returns to the burning city and frantically searches for her, her ghost appears and urges him to leave. And I'm going to be quoting from Stanley Lombardo's translation, which was done for performance, so that I think it's the easiest one to hear. And I'm also not giving you PowerPoint or handouts because most medieval education was oral. Most students did not have their own copies of texts. And looking at manuscripts, although it's a lot of fun or hard work, depending on how you're feeling in a given day, is not what most students would have been doing. So I'm trying to give you a little bit of that experience yourselves, although I know you may want pictures instead. As Aeneas recounts this vision to Dido, I quote, there rose before my eyes the sad ghost of Creusa herself, an image larger than life. I was transfixed, my hair stood on end, and my voice choked. Then she spoke to me and calmed my fears. Quote, what good does it do you, my sweet husband? And over each of these pronouns, we have pronouns written in over the lines, making it clear she's talking to him and kind of emphasizing the emotional connection between them. So after husband, it's glossed Oanea. To indulge in such mad grief, these things do not happen without the will of the gods. You may not take your Creusa, in the same manuscript I'm talking about says, that is me, your wife, just to make it clear. The Lord of Olympus does not allow it, and I skip some now. The Great Mother keeps me on these shores. Farewell, Aeneas added, and keep well the love for our child. And the love is glossed, that is yours and mine. Creusa spoke and then left me there, weeping with many things yet to say. She vanished into thin air. 3 times I tried to put my arms around her. 3 times her wraith slipped through my hands, soft as a breeze, like a vanishing dream. While scholars might focus on Homeric echoes at the end of this scene, schoolboys in liminal stages of their lives may have felt a particular attraction to vulnerable fictional characters, and to have been able to identify with abandoned characters like Dido and Creusa, and Aeneas himself, for it is actually he who is left alone in this scene. While this passage does not receive as much attention in medieval manuscripts as Dido's speeches, it is often glossed, but with additional emphasis on Aeneas' pain at the end. In a manuscript in the British Library that contains both the Aeneid and also one of the texts I'll be talking about in the next lecture, there are little pictures of the characters, men's heads drawn in profile, women drawn in 3/4 busts at significant scenes. Here in Creusa's, at the beginning of Creusa's speech, is drawn a profile of a weeping Aeneas, and his description of trying to embrace her is highlighted with little brackets afterwards, so that we have a kind of double empathy, one for her and one for him thinking about her and losing her. There's unfortunately little emphasis that identification and empathy with fictional women creates sympathy with real women, abandoned or not. Some historians of later periods have postulated that reading texts exploring the emotions of fictional women in pain can lead to greater social awareness and action. This seemingly attractive proposition is not supported by studies of the effects of classroom empathy in the pre-modern period, however. And neurological research cited by Suzanne Keene calls it into question for the later centuries as well. While such findings may disappoint those for whom classroom experience is valued primarily in terms of its effects on later adult behavior, they do suggest that the classroom can function as an escape from the world outside. The exploration of forbidden and/or impossible actions and feelings may be one of the great possibilities of the classroom in any period. Taking on the emotion of a character can become an extension of the self, a projection or a fantasy. An emotional connection with the patently unreal can, therefore, have an especially profound effect in an environment focused on the learning, the imprinting of literary texts, especially those from other eras. And in a single-sex environment, gender can be as exotic as divine nature or royal status. In addition, emotional content could have helped make the close attention to the text, the endless word-for-word variation and commentary that was necessary in the medieval classroom, bearable and even desirable from a pedagogical standpoint. Recent research on empathy also finds that, quote, the perception of fictionality by readers actually increases their empathic response to a text, unquote. The emotional passages in the Aeneid do have a particular attraction for young readers. They stay in the memory, sometimes to a disturbing degree, and this was probably a deliberate part of the pedagogy that focused on this text. Perhaps even more significantly, and here I'm quoting research again, quote, empathic responses to fictional characters and situations occur more readily for negative emotions, unquote. And I would put Dido's pain and emotional suffering at the top of that list. Paradoxically, quoting modern research again, empathy for fictional characters appears to require only minimal elements of identity, situation, and feeling, unquote. These minimal requirements may be why empathy with fictional characters does not necessarily translate into empathy with real persons who share with the characters other qualities of overriding significance to us, such as gender. This research helps to explain why the intensity of Dido's pain was more significant than her gender in generating Augustine's response to her. In addition, comparatively simple, straightforward characters generate empathy more readily than more sophisticated literary ones. Thus, the stark simplicity of Dido's story held Augustine in thrall, whereas the more complex character and conflicted emotions of Aeneas left him cold, a not uncommon reaction in the classroom even today. Although Augustine's overwhelming emotional reaction to Dido may be the earliest and most famous schoolboy reminiscence of her, medieval school manuscripts of the Aeneid manifest a continuing emphasis on her emotions. The clearest evidence of the emphasis comes from school manuscripts of the classics copied between around 900 to 1200. During the 10th through the 12th centuries, in France, Italy, and especially Central Europe, a surprising number of school manuscripts of classical texts contain a type of musical notation called neumes that have been added to especially emotional passages. Often the neumed passages in narrative verse texts are in the voices of women characters. For while both male and female speeches were neumed, Jan Zokowski in his comprehensive study of neuming states, quote, speeches that give utterance to the passions of women in matters of love are singled out for close attention by neuming. And most importantly, the frenzy of Dido in the fourth book of the Aeneid, as it reveals itself in her speeches, garnered more attention from I don't know whether you pronounce this numators, whatever. Anyway, than any other episode in any classical Latin poem, unquote. These passages were not, to the best of our knowledge, read in isolation. Instead, during this period, entire texts were studied and performed in monastic classrooms, with a text like the Aeneid probably taking about a year. And special passages were sung for added emotional impact. As Zokowski notes, quote, in medieval schools, consecutive passages of whatever text was studied were performed aloud. This practice meant that speeches in texts carried even greater weight then than now. We have no idea what neumed passages sound like. We know they go up and down, we don't know how much they go up and down, and we know nothing about the quality of the sound. This is lucky for me, because I'm going to read translations of several of them, and I'm not going to sing. Imagine them performed by an adolescent boy, either with great pathos or over-the-top histrionics, or a combination thereof. All these versions would, I suspect, be historically accurate for the classroom, as they often are in today's student performances. These passages were set to music or chanted, whatever the neumes meant, because of their content, their emotional content. There is another kind of neuming on another kind of passage, but this one is all for emotion. All of the neumed passages in the narrative text convey strong feeling, although not all emotional passages are neumed. Here are two new sections of speeches that happen to occur side by side in a 2-column 12th century German manuscript from the monastery at Tegernsee. It's now in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, also digitized online, as are most of the Neumed manuscripts in that library. They are from Dido's famous first 2 speeches to Aeneas after she finds out he's going to leave her. In the first speech, the Neuming begins when Dido moves from anger at Aeneas to begging him to stay. As is often the case with translations, the translator has had to add in phrases that are actually not in Virgil, but that occur in the glosses. So that Virgil uses the verb oro for I beg you or I pray only once. Stanley Lombardo uses it twice. And in a 13th century Italian manuscript of the Aeneid in Berlin, the glossator adds it 3 times over different phrases, namely, I beg you, Aeneas. Namely, I beg you, Aeneas. That is, I beg you, Aeneas, over and over through the passage above the lines. Quote, is it me you are fleeing? By these tears I beg you, by your right hand, which is all that I have left, by the marriage we have entered upon. If I have ever done anything to deserve your thanks, if I have ever been in any way dear to you, have pity on a house destined to fall. And if there's still room for prayers, I beg you, change these plans of yours. It's because of you the Libyan warlords hate me, and my own Tyrians abhor me, and because of you that my honor has been snuffed out, the good name I once had, my only hope to ascend to the stars. To what death do you leave me, dear guest? All that I can call the man I once called husband, unquote. As you know, her words fail. Aeneas responds that they were never married and that there are greater things in store for him anyway. One of my favorite glosses on his rather cool response comes from a late Italian manuscript, which says that Aeneas' speech is notable for its ingratitude, unquote. Another roughly contemporaneous manuscript says, just next to the beginning of the speech, Virgil damns Aeneas, unquote. Dido's reaction is swift and violent. After directing a few vicious phrases to him, she begins to speak of him in the third person, and it is her description of his lack of a reaction that is neumed in the second speech in the Munich manuscript. Why should I hold back? Did he sigh as I wept? Did he even look at me? Did he give in to tears or show any pity for the woman who loved him? I took him in, shipwrecked on my shore, destitute, and insanely shared my throne with him. I recovered his fleet and rescued his men. Oh, I'm whirled by the furies on burning winds, unquote. Neuming ends around 1200, roughly the same time as the foundation of the cathedral schools that fostered a more urban setting and greater production of manuscripts for schools, although the classical texts continued to be copied in monastic scriptoria as well. As I said, I've been looking at later manuscripts of the Aeneid and other school texts to see whether the same kinds of passages continue to be emphasized. The short answer is yes. Emotional passages continue to be emphasized. Later glossators sometimes focused on different passages or parts of passages, however, and sometimes in different ways. For example, that same 13th century manuscript of the Aeneid in Berlin that I quoted earlier about Dido's first speech also carefully notes Dido's shift in address in the second speech, where she reacts to Aeneas' lack of empathy. When she begins speaking, a gloss says, Dido's talking to Aeneas. But when the Neuming starts in the other manuscript, the Berlin commentator notes the change differently. This gloss says, Dido here does not speak to Aeneas, but to those listening, about the cruelty of that Aeneas. This gloss also serves as a stage direction. She turns and speaks to those around her about how he is treating her. And her confrontation with him, like her humiliation then, is public. This marginal gloss projects a group setting, as would have been the case in the classroom where the text was being read, that is, performed. The continuing pedagogical emphasis on pathetic scenes in classical texts served several purposes, the most important of which was mnemonic. We can see this approach in action in a short gloss encircled in the margin of a 13th century French manuscript in the British Library, Burney 273. It lists emotional events as a method of recalling the first 6 books of the Aeneid. Only 7 lines long, this gloss literally encapsulates the first 6 books of the poem in emotional terms. Quote, in this book is contained the pity or the pathos, it's not clear, the word is miseratio, of Dido. In the second, the death of Creusa. In the third, the death of Anchises. In the fourth, of Dido. In the fifth, of Palinurus. In the sixth, of Marcellus. All but one of the references are to deaths, and the one that is not associates Dido with emotion. In this deaths gloss, as I like to think of it, Dido is the memory key to 2 of the 6 books. Her Miseratio is the focus of the first book according to this scheme, and then follow the deaths. Creusa's in book 2, that of Aeneas's father in book 3, of course Dido's in book 4, and that of Aeneas's pilot Palinurus in book 5, a death that leaves Aeneas both literally as well as figuratively adrift. In book 6 is described the death, or rather the short future life foretold, of Marcellus, the son of Octavia, sister to the emperor. Aeneas is not mentioned at all. This deaths gloss is located at the end of book 3 at the transition from the death of Anchises, father of the protagonist Aeneas, to the death of Dido. But if it's a purely mnemonic device, shouldn't it have been placed either at the beginning of book 1 or the end of book 6? Some of you may have recognized, however, that this description of the 6 books actually is a reworking of part of Servius's last gloss on the end of book 3, where Anchises dies and Aeneas finishes his narrative for Dido, which has occupied all of books 2 and 3. It comes at the words, "He fell silent at last." The first part of Servius's gloss discusses the first 6 books as a whole. Quote, "In the style of Controversiae, he, Virgil, gave conclusions to the first 6 books, which he wished to be, I think the word must mean organically structured, something like that, biotikos. He allotted specific subjects to specific books, all things to the first book, pathos to the second, wanderings to the third, ethical dilemma to the fourth, celebration to the fifth, and knowledge to the sixth. He also varied their conclusions, so that in the first was the Miseratio of Dido, in the second the death of Creusa, in the third of Anchises, fourth, you know what's coming next. In the fourth of Dido, in the fifth of Palinurus, in the sixth he mourns the quick death of Marcellus. The medieval rephrasing and repurposing of this gloss is typical of what I referred to earlier as medieval practicality. With a few changes, what Servius presented as a structural mnemonic has become an emotional one. The Servian context does clarify the meaning of Dido's Miseratio. He did not mean her pity for the Trojans early in Book 1, but rather the ending, Dido, unhappy woman, prolonged the night with varied conversations and drank deeply the draught of love. And that manuscript with the little pictures that I told you about, it has a picture here of Dido holding a little cup, drinking her emotional poison. The repurposing of the gloss in the medieval manuscript ignores Servius's listing of the content of each of the first 6 books as a whole, focusing instead on what Servius describes as the endings, but seeing them rather as major components of the books and emphasizing their parallelism. I do not know whether the person who added this gloss to the Burney copy of the Aeneid was the one who adapted it from Servius. The other encircled glosses in the manuscript that I've checked do not seem to be from Servius. Yet the gloss is placed next to the text where it's found in Servius. Yet that the gloss is placed next to the text where it's found in Servius would certainly suggest that this commentator or someone he was copying from knew its origin and deliberately simplified it. But the effect of the small changes is profound. As Zolkowski notes about the earlier Neumed manuscripts, part of the attention that the speeches of Dido exerted would have been the spectrum of emotions they covered. Pathos, which has been rightly identified as a basic constituent of the Aeneid, is nowhere more salient than in the 4th book. At the same time, as rhetorical objects, the speeches are supremely complex. The two preoccupations of grasping both the emotions and the rhetoric come to the fore in the glosses and comments. Later manuscripts add emphasis by kinds of highlighting that are very different, but almost as easy to see as Neuming when glancing through a manuscript. We often see manicula, or little pointing hands, also known as manicules to scholars of the early modern period, thanks to William Sherman's study. In addition, squiggly lines, some people have said maybe we should call them brackets, nobody's really given them a term yet, mark off a section of text. Where both signs are used, brackets call attention to a whole passage, while a maniculum literally points to a specific line, often one making a comment about human behavior in general, such as proverbs and sententia, that could be reused in the student's own compositions. Like numing, these kinds of highlighting function as both finding aids and performance cues. In a densely annotated 15th century northern manuscript of the works of Virgil in Vienna, continuous interlinear glosses and numerous marginal comments show why other kinds of highlighting are necessary and extremely important. In other words, if you've got a really, really highly glossed manuscript, you need big kinds of things to point out particular passages because all the pages look the same otherwise. Maniculum points to the line, "Are lovers ever really fooled?" At the transition back to Dido, after Aeneas decides to wait for the right time to tell her he's leaving. It's a significant comment on the situation at that point in the book, but it's also an aphorism of manifold application. The commentator of the Vienna manuscript also highlights with squiggle brackets a longer initial portion of Dido's first speech to Aeneas after finding out that he will leave. The highlight continues through lines that we read earlier where she begs him to stay, and additional brackets highlight the end of the speech, where she says that if she were pregnant, she would at least have something of Aeneas to remember him by. I'm going to skip down a little bit here. In fact, the only lines of this speech not highlighted are those where she refers to her neighboring enemies, although there is a marginal gloss identifying one of them. Yet while there is full interlinear glossing on the entire speech, there are only a few marginal comments on the highlighted section. One is at line 310, where Dido calls Aeneas cruel, and the glossator says, "Bitter is the speech of love." Over this word and over the next are multiple interlinear glosses, but they are too crammed together to differentiate, even with high magnification. It is possible to read the interlinear glosses on the first 4 lines of this speech in a contemporary Italian manuscript in Rome. These 4 lines are double highlighted by not only the marginal squiggle bracketing, but also an added nota as well. Furthermore, there are interlinear glosses, sometimes multiple ones, throughout the speech. Okay, this is an experiment. I want to try to convey some of the flavor of continuous interlinear glosses, which often accompany every word of the text in school manuscripts. And not just every word, but where sometimes you'll have 5 or 6 glosses over an individual word. I've not provided a handout or PowerPoint, as I mentioned, because students would have heard the glosses more often than they would have read them, and I hope that this little experiment will provide a sense of the experience of the oral approach for medieval students. I would also appreciate feedback on how it feels to you. I experiment on my students all the time, and their reactions have been very important for me. Sometimes reading about a classroom practice in isolation in one's office is a much less historically accurate kind of research than trying it out on a group of listeners, a captive audience like I have right now. In Lombardo's translation, the highlighted lines read as follows. "Traitor, did you actually hope you could conceal this crime and sneak away without telling me? Does our love mean nothing more to you? Doesn't it matter that we pledged ourselves to each other? Do you care that Dido will die a cruel death?" Interlinear glosses, as the name implies, are glosses written between the lines. More exactly, they start as high as possible up above a word so that they actually look as if they belong to the line above. They're right under the line above. And then the commentator adds more going down like this, so that only texts that have multiple 3, 4, 5 glosses go all the way down to the word above. Thus one reads them vertically from the top of the space between the lines down. That written lowest is written last, but for a student listening, they are heard as continuous and sequential elaboration. I've got a little discussion here, sort of theoretically, about glosses, but I'm going to skip it because we started a little late and I don't want to carry it too long. I can talk about it afterwards. First, I shall read a very literal translation of these lines. This translation is not completely literal, though, because without the glosses, I either have to add in one word or take a word out. That is, the glossed version is more complete or more worked out. Okay, here's the literal one. Traitor, did you hope you could conceal so great a crime and silently leave my land? Does neither our love, nor our pledges, nor Dido, about to die, facing cruel ruin, hold you? Now the elaborated version for the student, with multiple glosses over some words and the short marginal comments that first identify and then comment on what she is saying. And again, this is highly speculative. We have no idea how glosses are read aloud. In other words, whether you did one word and then the gloss or the other, but my feeling is that on these intensely glossed parts, the glossing was part of what was read to the students after they'd been through it once. So here, the words of Dido to Aeneas after the news of his departure reaches her ears. Note this. O cruel, faithless traitor, did you have hope you could conceal, could fake what you knew to be so great a crime, a wickedness, that is leaving me, and silently not speaking with me? Yes, did you hope to leave from my land? Because at any rate, you couldn't leave so silently that I would not know. Does neither our love, O traitor, nor our pledges, oath joined to oath, detain you? Nor does Dido, about to die as a result of your departure, facing cruel ruin, death, hold you? That is, she's not holding you back from leaving, as if she were saying it ought to. This last phrase, as if she were saying it ought to, is among the most telling of the thousands of comments that I've read. Dido feels that knowing that she will die should keep Aeneas from leaving her, but of course it does not. Such elaborations by the commentator, such as when he says 2 lines earlier, because at any rate you could not leave so silently that I would not know, keep us longer in Dido's anger and pain. This fanatically close attention to the text and variation can seem mind-numbing when we look at a manuscript. But this is, I think, wrong. From a pedagogical point of view, the constant elaboration of almost every word generates verbal facility and fecundity. And it actually gets taken even further in certain early modern commentaries, like the one by Jan de la Cerda, who did the commentary that was probably the inspiration for Milton and that he learned the text from, who changes the first word into a noun and then gives us 15 different versions of other ways to say that noun, which I'm going to spare you, but I've got it if anyone wants to hear it. From an emotional standpoint, glosses can help us fix feelings in the heart of the listener, especially with the speeches of Dido, which dominate the second half of Book 4 until her death. Even generic, predictable grammatical glosses can generate an emotional vibration. The speech of Dido's that was actually most neumed in earlier manuscripts is Dido's speech to her sister Anna, begging Anna to in turn beg Aeneas, not for him to stay, for she's given up on that by that point, but for more time before he departs, so that she can get used to his leaving. The pathos, she has lost herself in her future, self-delusion, if anything, this begging would push him away, and final acceptance, she says here that she will die, are heartbreaking. The first words of this famous lament, also much set to music in the early modern period, are the simple phrase, "E soror," go sister. But they are almost always glossed the very same way, with the little vocative cue O, and then simply her sister's name, so that it reads with the glosses, "Go sister, O Anna." The addition of the name and the consequent minute delay before the rest of the line somehow makes the speech especially moving when I see it in manuscripts. I expect and I want that gloss. The attention to minute detail in pre-modern teaching methods has been roundly criticized, but I've tried to help you experience how close even myopic attention to individual words and phrases can also further imprint a text in the heart as well as the mind of a student. While I am most interested in the attention paid to female emotion because of its patently unreal character for medieval boys, there are manuscripts of the Aeneid that emphasize male emotion. For example, the glosses and highlighting in a 15th century manuscript in Venice pay as much attention to male feelings as female in the first 6 books, including Book 4. And in addition, it notes male pathos in the second part more consistently than almost every other manuscript I've examined. There are very few interlinear glosses in this Venice manuscript, which may mean that it was not a school manuscript, although speeches are identified and most are highlighted. Speeches are, however, also of course a sign of humanist, that is, adult male textual interest. At the beginning of this talk, I spoke about the male emotion of the schoolboy Augustan generated by Virgil's Aeneid. Now at the end, let us return to Augustine when he returns once more to the Aeneid as an adult. For it was books 2 through 4 of the Aeneid, that is, those holding his favorite schoolboy memories, that Augustine turned for rest and distraction during the intense transitional period after his conversion. At a country house outside Milan, he wrote his early Christian dialogues in the company of a few pupils and friends, and his mother who cooked for them. A group that Gerald Bonner describes as, quote, less a poetry reading society and far more like a university tutorial, unquote. One of them, Licentius, a poetry writing student of Augustine and son of his friend and sometime patron Romanianus, called it, quote, a golden age of leisure and study, unquote. It was at this point, according to Licentius, that Augustine rekindled his interest in the Aeneid by submitting it to, quote, the arduous labor of reading for the inner sense divulged in books and discovered through his ingenuity, unquote. Licentius's short verse memoir of this time evokes nostalgia for a text read with a revered teacher, often one of the strongest of school memories. And we are reminded that allegorical interpretation of the Aeneid, if that was what Augustine was engaged in, was an occupation for adults, not schoolboys. But while the adult Augustine was able to use the power of Virgil's poetry as a distraction and respite, young Augustine's feelings for Dido were so strong that they put into shadow all other emotions at that time. The boy who begins the next lecture, young Achilles, never feels like a woman or weeps for one. But he does, at least for a time, act like one. Thank you.